Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast Too Much Disinformation, the pod that uncovers the good, the bad, and the fake of the online world. I'm your host, Rafi Mendelsohn, and on today's pod, we are going to be talking about communities, not just online communities as we experience, many of us most days experience them, but actually the evolution of communities and the role that it plays in society and how those communities are manifesting themselves on the online space. It's going to be a really fascinating discussion, and leading us through that is Sonia Cook-Broen, and she's the founder of the Tech Margin, which aims to bring more women and underrepresented people into tech jobs. She's also a CTO via AcornOak, which is a fractional executive leadership service, and she's a regular speaker on the tech scene and has held senior developer positions at companies including Salesforce and the threat intelligence company Crowdstrike. Let's start the show. Hey Sonia, how you doing?
I'm great, Rafi. It's nice to see you.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for taking the time. We always start by asking the same question to every guest that comes on. Tell us, what was your first ever social media platform?
Okay. Well, I'm going to date myself a little, and I'm not sure if it's technically social media, but AOL chat rooms. So, and then I, like many of your guests, MySpace, which I loved because you could code and like style it. And it was actually my mom who turned me onto Facebook way back when. And I really preferred MySpace, but I guess that says something about the first mover advantage.
You say that embarrassingly, but when there was AOL Messenger, that was a monopoly. Like that was the only way of communicating. Like that was, everyone was using that.
Oh yeah, the disc, and you had to dial up the ding. Yeah. Kids today have no idea.
Amazing. So AOL, then MySpace, then Facebook, and now what's the most recent account that you've opened?
Well, I don't. So I do a lot of social media for my own business, and also for my husband is an artist, so I do his social media.
So I think this is going to kind of get to the core of the discussion that we're going to cover today, because you really want to talk about communities and the kind of role of communities. And it sounds like kind of your relationship with the communities online has changed. It's a tough topic of conversation that we don't always talk about in the industry. And I think, we come at these different conversations during the course of these podcast episodes from different people, and we touch upon the negativities and the challenges of social media. But actually today, what we're here to talk about is communities generally. And that, of course, includes for so many people today, the online experiences that we have. And so, for those who have been listening so far a few minutes in thinking, this is weird, this kind of conversation about the online space, but we're talking about coming off social media. So maybe let's take it back and talk about communities themselves and what, in your opinion, what are kind of the roles, the responsibility of communities have taken place traditionally?
Absolutely, Rafi. Well, during the pandemic, like all of us, had a lot of time to go inside one's own mind, and I started to read a lot of books about philosophy and humanity as a species. And one of the books that really gelled with me was Nigel Harare's *Sapiens*, and in that he talks about the ideal community size for an individual is about 100 people, and that's why things start to break down when we have larger networks, because typically there's not a shared purpose as the network gets larger. And then to kind of fast forward from the dawn of man, and when we only had small tribes, here we are in, the era we're in, and we have what are publicly traded companies that are serving as basically what we take for granted as the public square. But we forget that they are publicly traded companies and they have profit motives to keeping us there. So that means, the most salacious posts, the most triggering posts are the ones that are just algorithmically boosted. So we've actually moved. They're kind of, in my mind, the antithesis of what a social square should look like. But do you want me to talk a little bit about how I got to my thinking around the outcome-oriented?
Well, I had a couple of questions about what you said so far, because it's super interesting. And I think that the shared communities have shared outcomes, right? And how that the concept of kind of 100 as the limit. I think there are some people that agree with that. And then there are like other people, when you were saying that, I was thinking, yeah, but the one of the things that I love about social media is that the shared outcome might be around different interests. You might have different shared outcomes, right? One of my shared outcomes is my local community and also my family. And so there's a few connections there. But also as well, it's I'm mad about sports and soccer. So the shared outcome of the people of the community in the soccer groups that I'm in are going to be a completely different shared outcomes for the rest of the aspects of my life. So maybe that's okay. Is it okay to have more contacts if we are able to compartmentalize the different shared outcomes, even if they're on one big platform?
Yeah, exactly, Rafi. I think that is where we're going. I think what is called in the more like strict definition, and like there's platforms that are just for this, is outcome oriented communities, but we kind of create those communities naturally in larger platforms like Facebook or I suppose to some extent Instagram, but that's not really a grouping, Discord, Slack, but where I think it starts to kind of break down is if everyone in that group doesn't have that shared outcome in mind, that's when it starts to be like easy for a lot of nasty things that you wouldn't actually do to a person who's standing right in front of you, right? You'd never say these things to somebody who was there, face to face. It's really easy to hide behind a keyboard. And I do think we can have larger groups than 100 people, especially today, but I think we have to be mindful of how we're doing that. Like, it's not just put everybody together in this giant platform and expect it all to work well. And silos aren't good either. But I think the more we look to this like broad landscape where there's a lot of reactionary posts, things that trigger us, we're actually looking farther and farther away from our local physical world too. And I find that particularly problematic. I think we do have to strike that balance, basically.
Okay. And about the town square, I know you have some interesting thoughts about that analogy that I often hear about, that I often use myself, about social media. The online experiences that we have today is kind of like the town square of today.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's what we think it is, or at least maybe that's what we tell ourselves it is. But, if you really stop and think about what a ideal town square is like, and in, the ancient democratic tradition where oration and shared dialogue was the idea of a town square, that is definitely not where we're at with social media. But I would say we're maybe more akin to the town square where you have somebody who everybody kind of walks past like, oh, please don't look at me, that's standing on a box and yelling. I think we're kind of more in that space now.
Amazing. And so do you see that need for, okay, I want to have one area, or maybe they don't want to expose themselves? Is there a backlash, or is that what we're experiencing, of kind of people and the way that they experience and are using social media? Or are people not there yet, if at all?
It's a great question. And I think it's always hard to answer for everyone. So I'll just do my best. Because when we work in tech, we kind of have this bubble around us, because we talk to people who work in tech, we think about tech all the time. So we see the trends that are kind of at the bleeding edge. I think the majority of people, they're living their lives, they're using platforms that work for them okay. And sometimes it's hard to see a better option if you think, well, there's nothing really wrong with this. Like, I think as technologists, though, I have a lot of conversations with colleagues and friends and people I've, just acquainted with in this field, where a lot of us have moved away from the traditional social media platforms, in some ways because they've been actually quite negative to our mental health. So I think there is a trend to look for something better. I don't think that better or that answer is there yet. And it might just look like many different answers. And that's okay too.
Do you think that the social media platforms themselves would evolve and move on more in line with the kind of separation? I mean, Google Plus, for example, had circles, was it called, or where you could create the different bubbles of groups and around interest or whatever you wanted. That kind of was, but that was Google Plus. Rest in peace.
Yeah, I know what happened. I think that the platforms that we have that are very large today, the Facebook and to some extent even ones that I think have an overall positive social benefit, like even the professional networks like LinkedIn, I don't think they have an incentive to change that much, because they're where everyone is, and that's the kind of magic of creating a social media platform that's good enough that people stay there. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think they have an incentive to change. I don't think that from the bottom line standpoint, there's a problem there,
Okay. And okay, so let's take it kind of forward. What do you see if this is a trend that you're seeing, born out of a need and a want to have kind of a closer knit community of shared outcomes, shared interests? Then that logic follows that people are going to start to follow this thinking and want something else, want something different. What does that something different look like?
Right. Like showing the way, I think, is the key here. I mean, it probably isn't going to come from the big platforms, but it will probably come from influencers and people, just talking about what they're finding that works for them. I guess I can backtrack a little bit in my own perspective shift. When I joined Salesforce, I suddenly was in this Slack with 80,000 people, and I've been using Slack for years. I've been working remotely way before the pandemic, so I'm very comfortable with like connecting deeply with people I've never met before. But I was blown away by the amount of supportive groups that were, whether it's helping each other with a technical problem, or whether it was, basically Salesforce is a bit, I think most people know this, they're a big leader in the, diversity and inclusion space, and they have a ton of groups to support people of different walks of life. And I was on the leadership committee of the neurodiversity subgroup, and it was fantastic to meet people from this massive company from all over the world, really deeply caring about the same thing. And something shifted in my mind about the potential of this kind of platform. If you can get that piece right, if you can get that shared common goal and that greater desire to help one another, like we're all there for the same reason. And I know that sounds a little utopian, but I can say that since leaving Salesforce, I was part of the big tech layoffs at the beginning of 2023, and I was really sad to lose access to that community. But what I found was I didn't. I'm still in touch with so many of the people that I was close to there. And, we're having these conversations about how do you keep this going outside of one particular employer, and almost like, the social media influencers say, and, content creators say, don't rely on one single platform, take your audience with you. Well, don't rely on your employer to give you this. We need to, not all employers are Salesforce, and you can't rely on Salesforce to always be like Salesforce. So I think people are starting to create them themselves with platforms like Circle, Discourse. I've noticed a lot of the website platforms are starting like community subscriptions that you can stand up to create your own micro community. So I think it's a very organic kind of bootstrappy feel right now. I know there's like Discord, but everything's kind of invite. It's almost like everything's starting to become invite only if you want that kind of truly outcome oriented group.
Back to smaller communities, we're saying, back to smaller groups?
There is probably an ideal size for each given group, even if it's not on a big platform. But, like you said, like your sports, I'm not a sports person, so I always joke, your sports ball groups, if you have 20,000 people in there, you're not going to have conversations. Probably you might have spin-offs, right? Even even when there's a shared interest, I think large groups tend to spin off subgroups because people want to engage one-on-one with one another.
So if we look, back at the communities that we were involved in, and historically they were based around where we lived, right? And people didn't travel so much. We're going back, and so those were the communities, and you pretty much stayed. You were born and you stayed and you lived and you died in the same kind of region, spot. So if we take that now, what are the you mentioned this perfect example of a Slack channel you were in, and then you weren't in any longer, and you've managed to maintain some of those conversations, but there's a bigger community there. So now, rather than staying in the exact same spot, we're actually moving, or we might have that move forced upon us. We might actually be blocked from a social media platform, or people stop using that social media platform, and people have built up these communities and these friendships. What does that do to us when we have those communities taken away, or if we change communities?
That's a great question. Well, I think, just speaking for myself, when I was no longer at Salesforce, initially that was the thing that I felt the most acutely was, oh no, like I'm not going to have access to all of these amazing people. And it really hurt. Like a friend moved away, like you said, when we were, even many of us can recall a time in our life where we had a close friend move away, or we had to move. It's that kind of feeling. It's actually heartbreaking in a way. And I think that says something about the way our brains are wired. Connection is connection, no matter where it happens.
Amazing. It's super fascinating, and kind of unpacking the community. And I don't think we often take enough of time to take a step back and say, okay, what is that trying to do? And what is that also replacing, right? What are those needs? I mean, I personally think that it enriches in so many different ways. There are challenges, but it's amazing to be part of something, or you could have a new interest and then be part of that community. But there are challenges. There are kind of upsides and downsides. Do you think there are kind of benefits themselves that are new benefits that we haven't discovered previously?
Oh my goodness, 100%. Even on the social media platforms, that the larger ones that we have today, that aren't like more like distributed closed systems that you have to have an invite to, even the larger platforms, I know so many people have found community, have found connection, or even identity. I have, my children have like experienced all of the growing up, parts of growing up through the pandemic. And that was a way that they were able to connect with people who, could give them a sense of foundation, whether it was my son, who's a big climber, and connecting out with the climbing community. And, but I think we just have to be careful about the information we consume, because and just be mindful about how it's making us feel, right? Like if we're getting that sense of support, connection, and, friendship, then that's a great outcome. But if we're scrolling and, again, these platforms do have a motive that is not what we're talking about, right? And I think that's the key of why we have to, as individuals, be careful about the information we're consuming and how we're feeling when we're consuming that information. And I think many of us just consume information, go out into the world all torqued up, angry that they read this thing, and then they have to post back, and it's still happening. And that's not good. That's not a good outcome, right? Like, you're not changing anything by letting yourself feel those feelings for something so far removed from where you actually are, and maybe something that was just put out there to incite you.
So you mentioned the book earlier in the conversation. What was the name of the book?
Sapiens. It's a really good book. It's kind of it goes from like the dawn of humankind to pretty much like I think it goes up to like maybe I'm not sure if it goes all the way to the Industrial Revolution, but you go on a long voyage of our evolution as a species. It's very fascinating.
Interesting. And we'll include kind of any mentions or links or things that you refer to in the show notes, so that everyone who's listening can access them pretty easily.
I've got a great recommendation about disruptive technology. So a friend of mine who's been working a lot in the AI space lately, Noah Breyer from brand.ai, he recommended in a post he wrote about disruptive technology. It's a book called Black Swan by Nassim Taleb, and just an amazing perspective on why our brains aren't really equipped to handle like this kind of disruptive technology head on. It's sort of through these conversations and digesting it as we're living it that we start to understand this world that we're in.
Amazing. And I know there's a bunch of different topics that you cover and you talk about regularly. Where can people follow your stuff, listen to you, hear you?
Absolutely. So my website is probably the most central location. Follow me on LinkedIn, Sonia Cook-Broen, and also my company, The Tech Margin, and www.thetechmargin.com. I have a newsletter you can subscribe to from there as well, and a YouTube channel.
Fantastic. So what we'd like to do in terms of wrapping up each pod is to get everyone's perspective on one good thing, one bad thing, and one fake thing that you are seeing in the online space.
Okay, great. So good.
Challenge.
Yeah, I'm going to go with bad first because I love to end with good news. So bad is, isolation, separation, harmful output of energy towards other people. Bad. Good. I feel like I'm going to quote a terrible line, like, I always rely on the kindness of strangers. But seriously, connecting with people you've never met before in a deep and meaningful way. And some of my best friends I've never met in person. These are people I've worked with for years. I love them. They're allies, they're mentors, they're mentees of my, so that is the real potential of this connected world that we live in. And then I think one fake thing is the idea that people hate each other, because they don't. And I don't think we want to hate each other. I really don't. I think that serves an old perspective that it just keeps us divided. And I just don't think that's where we really want to be as human beings when you get down to it.
Fascinating. I really appreciate the time you've taken to go through these ideas and unpack them and give us the opportunity just to take a moment and say, okay, what's the need? What's the want that we want from communities, and why it's important, and take a second to think about that, which I think is really important. So thank you for taking that time. We really appreciate it, and have a great day, Sonia.
Thank you, Rafi. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.